The small cemetery lay shrouded in a peaceful silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of a passing car. Clusters of mourners gathered around the gravesite, their voices soft, their expressions somber. Some shared quiet words of comfort, while others exchanged bittersweet laughter over shared memories of the departed. At the edge of the crowd, an elderly man stood apart. His dark suit showed signs of age, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, and a simple hat dangled from his hands. He kept his eyes fixed on the casket, his posture rigid. Unlike the others, he seemed unwelcome, not through words, but in the subtle ways people position themselves, leaving a space as though his presence disturbed the sanctity of their mourning. A few people glanced his way, their expressions veiled with curiosity or faint disapproval. One woman leaned toward another and whispered, her words barely audible, but carrying far enough. "Why's he here? I don't recognize him." The man didn't react outwardly, but his fingers tightened around the brim of his hat. He shifted slightly, as though preparing to step forward, yet hesitated. It wasn't fear that held him back. It was the weight of judgment he could feel pressing from every direction. Despite their indifference, he remained rooted to the spot, his gaze unwavering. There was something in his expression, a blend of sorrow and determination, that hinted he had a purpose here that no one else understood. The service began, and the crowd leaned in closer to the preacher, instinctively drawing together. The elder lingered at the back, his presence like a shadow at the edge of their shared grief. Adjusting his jacket, he tried once again to edge forward, but the subtle shifts in their posture, a turn of a shoulder, averted eyes, reminded him he wasn't welcome. The preacher spoke of the deceased with warmth, recounting a life filled with achievements and the love of a close-knit community. The elder's face softened briefly at the mention of the name, a faint, wistful smile flickering and disappearing before anyone noticed. A woman near the front turned her head slightly, catching sight of him. She whispered to a neighbor, both glancing back before turning their attention away as though dismissing a fleeting thought. For the elder, the casket represented more than the end of someone's life. It held answers, memories, and truths tied to his presence here. Even as he stood alone, invisible to the mourners, he couldn't bring himself to leave. Earlier that day, his journey to the cemetery had started quietly. The road stretched long and empty, the scenery passing unnoticed as his mind wandered through fragments of old memories. The sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror shattered his thoughts. He pulled to the side of the road, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The officer approached, his stride confident, his eyes sharp. Without greeting, he barked, "License and registration." "Yes, sir," the man replied calmly, handing over his documents. The officer's gaze lingered on the papers before flicking back to the man. "You headed somewhere in a hurry?" the officer asked, suspicion dripping from his words. "To a funeral," the elder said, his voice steady. The officer smirked, leaning slightly closer. "A funeral? Fancy area for someone like you. Sure you're not lost?" The man's hands remained steady on the wheel. "I'm sure," he said quietly, meeting the officer's gaze without a hint of hostility. After a tense moment, the officer handed back his papers with a dismissive wave. "Don't cause any trouble," he muttered before turning back to his car. The elder resumed his journey, but the officer's words lingered. They played on a loop in his mind as he parked his car, straightened his jacket, and stepped out into the cemetery. The cold reception from the crowd felt like an extension of that earlier encounter. As the preacher continued speaking, the elder's thoughts drifted to a time long ago, to a place far from the quiet cemetery. He could almost feel the oppressive heat of the jungle, hear the deafening roar of gunfire, and the desperate shouts of men around him. His mind filled with the memory of carrying a young soldier, limp and bloodied, through the chaos. The weight of the man had tested his strength, but he didn't falter. Bullets tore through the air, and pain flared as one grazed his arm. But he pressed on, knowing that slowing down meant certain death. The soldier had lived because of him. It was a moment seared into his memory, a moment when he had been a hero. Yet, standing here now, surrounded by strangers, He felt like a forgotten relic, his deeds buried beneath the sands of time. The preacher's voice broke through his reverie. We gather to honor a man who was a friend, a father, and a hero to his community. The crowd nodded in unison, their emotions palpable. But the elder knew another truth about the man in the casket, a truth none of these people seemed to know or remember, a truth that, if revealed, would shift the narrative entirely. The elder's chest tightened at those words. He knew the man they mourned better than anyone else standing here, better than the grieving family, better than the preacher delivering the eulogy. Yet here he was standing alone, unseen, unacknowledged. He drew in a shaky breath, attempting to steady himself, but the weight of it was overwhelming. It wasn't just about this day. It was about all the other days like it. Every moment he had been overlooked, every silent judgment, every glance that seemed to say, "You don't belong here." Then, the preacher's tone shifted, breaking the elder's spiral of thought. His head lifted slightly, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the man's words. "But no great story stands alone," the preacher said. "Every life, every legacy, is shaped not only by what we accomplish, but by the sacrifices of those who stand with us. Sometimes the actions of others define our path." The elder's breath hitched. A low murmur spread through the gathering. He felt his pulse quicken as the preacher's words carried on. "What many of you may not know is that during his time of service, our brother faced a moment of life or death. In that moment, his life was saved, not by chance, but through the courage and sacrifice of another man." A wave of confusion rippled through the mourners, quiet whispers passing between them. The elder's hands shook slightly as he tightened his grip on the brim of his hat. Could this be possible? Could the deceased truly have remembered after all these years? He had spent so long convincing himself that his actions had been forgotten, that what he had done had faded into history, as silent and unseen as he was now. The preacher paused, scanning the crowd, then gestured toward the mourners. "And that man," he said with a steady voice, "is here with us today." The murmurs grew louder, heads turning as curious eyes searched for the unknown figure. The elder felt every gaze suddenly land on him. The pressure of their scrutiny was suffocating, but he couldn't move. He stood frozen, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the moment. The preacher's voice rang out again, clearer now. "The man who risked everything, who carried him to safety so he could return to his family and build the life we celebrate today. He stands among us." All at once, the whispers stopped. The judgment and dismissive glances were replaced by silence, a silence heavy with realization. The elder stood still, his heart thundering in his chest. For the first time since he arrived, the weight of their stares was not one of exclusion, but of something entirely different: reverence. The preacher nodded toward him, offering a kind smile. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we thank you for your bravery, for your sacrifice. Without you, the man we honor today would not have lived to create this legacy." The elder opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. He looked at the crowd, now gazing at him with expressions of gratitude, admiration, and even guilt. The shift in their demeanor was overwhelming, almost unbearable. Years of invisibility and isolation seemed to peel away, leaving him standing in the warmth of acknowledgement he hadn't felt in decades. The silence stretched, thick with emotion, as the preacher's words sank into the hearts of everyone present. Slowly, a middle-aged woman from the deceased family stepped forward. Her movements were tentative, her eyes glistening with unshed tears as she approached the elder. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. None of us knew." She hesitated, searching for the words. "I'm sorry. So deeply sorry." Her apology was halting, but the sincerity in her tone shattered the emotional barrier in the gathering. Another mourner, an older man, followed her lead. His voice cracked as he spoke. "You're the reason we had him all these years. You gave us our brother, our father, our friend. Without you, none of this would have been possible. We owe you everything." The elder finally managed to speak, his voice quiet but resolute. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said, his gaze fixed on the casket. "I did it because it was right. Out there, he was more than a soldier. He was my brother, and I would do it all over again if I had to. The air, once filled with tension and exclusion, softened. It was replaced by something gentler, something that felt like healing. The mourners approached him, one after another, offering heartfelt apologies, gratitude, and even tears. The woman who had earlier dismissed him moved closer, her face streaked with regret. She reached out, embracing him tightly as she sobbed. "Thank you. Thank you for everything. You gave us him." For the first time that day, the elder felt the heavy weight of judgment lifting. The loneliness that had accompanied him since he arrived seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of belonging and connection he hadn't expected to find. As the service drew to a close, the family stepped forward and invited him to join them at the front, beside the casket of the man he had saved all those years ago. They asked him to speak, to share a piece of their loved one's life that only he could tell, to give them a glimpse of the soldier who had lived because of his bravery. With trembling hands, the elder stepped forward. His voice was unsteady at first but grew stronger as he spoke. "We served together during a time when the world was divided in so many ways," he began. "But when you're out there, none of that matters. There, we were just men, brothers, fighting to survive and fighting for each other." He paused, his voice breaking slightly as the memories resurfaced. "On that day, I didn't see the color of his skin. I saw a promise I made to him and to every man out there, that I'd do everything I could to bring them home." The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word, their expressions a mix of awe, sorrow, and gratitude. "We live in a world that still struggles to look past the differences that divide us," the elder said, his voice calm but powerful. "But in the moments that matter most, those differences mean nothing. What truly matters is how we choose to show up for one another, how we see each other, and how we treat each other." He stepped back, his words settling over the crowd like a quiet blessing. Many stood motionless, tears streaming down their faces, moved not only by his story, but by the raw truth behind his message. As the service came to an end, several mourners lingered. They approached him, some to shake his hand, others to apologize, and still more to simply thank him. For the first time, he felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years, a sense that he belonged, not as an outsider, but as part of something bigger. Later, as the elder leaned against his car, he watched the family gathering near the gravesite. He saw children playing quietly, a young girl clutching her mother's hand, and adults exchanging heartfelt words. The image of the little girl who had hugged him earlier came back to him. Her innocent, unfiltered gratitude stood in stark contrast to the dismissive stares and whispers he'd endured when he first arrived. He turned back toward the casket one final time. His thoughts drifted to that fateful day during the war, the chaos, the fear, the impossible decision to risk his life for another. He could still feel the ache in his body, the burning exhaustion of carrying the wounded man through enemy fire. Despite the pain and danger, he had never once regretted his choice. It wasn't for medals or recognition. It was for a brother in need, and because it was the right thing to do. Even so, the years that followed had often felt like an uphill battle. His sacrifices had been overlooked, his story forgotten in a world too often consumed by division. Today had reminded him of that painful truth, but it had also been something else, a moment of clarity, of reckoning, and of hope. He climbed into his car, glancing toward the cemetery gates. Several mourners stood there, watching him leave. Some waved hesitantly, their expressions soft and humble. Their faces were different now, not just in their actions but in their intent. There was a newfound respect in their eyes, a recognition of the man they had nearly ignored. It wasn't enough to erase the years of invisibility, but it was a start. As the car rolled forward, the elder reflected on the moment. The road stretched out before him, long and uncertain, yet it felt different, brighter, as though the lessons of the day had not just shifted something in him, but in everyone who had stood at that funeral. He hoped they would carry those lessons forward, spreading them to others, building a world where no one had to fight to be seen. He whispered softly, as if speaking to the man they had laid to rest, "Rest easy, my brother. Maybe this time they'll remember This story isn't just about one man. It's about all of us, our assumptions, our biases, and the invisible walls we build between one another. Racism doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it's the quiet moments, averted eyes, whispered judgments, or the absence of acknowledgement. It grows in the spaces where silence replaces understanding. But today, something different happened. Today, the truth emerged, forcing everyone to confront their prejudices. They didn't just see a war hero. They saw a man whose life had been shaped by selflessness and quiet resilience. A man whose sacrifices had long gone unrecognized. Heroes like him walk among us every day, silent, overlooked, and uncelebrated. It's time we start noticing them. This is a call to action. Look past appearances, past assumptions, past the stories we tell ourselves about who belongs and who doesn't. Acknowledge the sacrifices, contributions, and humanity of every person, regardless of their race, background, or circumstances. The world doesn't change on its own. It changes when we choose to see each other, when we choose to listen, to learn, and to act. Today, the mourners at that funeral finally saw the man they had ignored. Let's ensure we don't need another moment like this to remind us of our shared humanity. Let's do better. See one another. Respect one another. Choose to be the change, because the world is watching, and it begins with us. As the elder drove into the setting sun, the sky streaked with gold and amber, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Not because of the recognition he'd received, but because of the hope it gave him. Hope that the world, flawed as it was, could still change.